atmosphere of Mars, with a view to a possible manned landing in the future, this was 25 years ago and it's still not happened. Unfortunately, the mission failed. The satellite burned up as it entered the Mars atmosphere. And the reason for that was because one team, NASA, wanted the whole project to be dealt with in metric, which is unusual for the Americans, as we know, because they are welded still to the imperial system of measurement. However, that was what the contractor, Lockheed Martin, who won the bid to build and operate the satellite, they were working in imperial. No problem, they said, we know the conversion factor. We know how many feet and inches there are in meters and centimeters. We can just do the conversion. Unfortunately, the satellite went 400 million miles. And when you do that conversion of 3 point whatever feet per yard into meters, it really matters on the decimal points, and they were 200 meters out when they went 400 million miles. Notice how I've seamlessly combined metric and imperial in my commentary, which only illustrates the point. Unfortunately, they weren't on that satellite project following a standard. They weren't following an agreed way. This is how we're going to work on this project. That's just an illustration of the problems of not having a unified standard in whatever we do in life. And we can remember, again, showing my age here, the Betamax and VHS video recorder debacle that took place. There were two systems and one had to win. Now, what you don't want as practitioners in terms of estimating and costing and answering your clients' questions, what you don't want are headlines like appeared at the time. Notice that one in the top right, metric maths mistake muffed Mars meteorological mission. There are people out there who are paid good money to come up with newspaper headlines like that. Brilliant. But the point is well made. Factor that into your professional life and advising clients. You do not want bad news because your client says to you, well, weren't you following a standard way of doing things? So your advice to me is of relatively little use because I don't know whether I can compare like with like. That's why standards are so important. And let me just reference, if I could, 3 particular documents. And I've already mentioned that I'm going to focus on the RICS Whole Life Carbon Assessment piece, which provides, we believe, a standardized way of measuring and therefore costing carbon. That's in the context of the middle document, which actually is an international standard and captures costing analysis, a system, a setup for analyzing construction costs in the same way globally and across capital cost, life cycle cost, and the carbon footprint, the carbon emissions from a particular project. And the document on the right is a flavor of the sort of work that we're doing at RICS in terms of sustainability and the need to meet the current challenge in the world. There it is. I think it's probably a well-known statistic at the top of the slide, which talks about the contribution from the built environment, building stuff, buildings, infrastructure, whatever. 40% of the global emissions of greenhouse gas come from the built environment. It's believed that without doing anything, it'll double by 2050. Now, I've put down 3 challenges. Statistically, the source for each of those is at the bottom of the slide. If we look at tier 1 contractors within the built environment sector, virtually all of their work is in embodied carbon. It accounts for the emissions of a typical tier 1 contractor. Virtually everything is captured in embodied carbon. We'll come back and unpack embodied carbon in a moment. Secondly, it is believed that undertaking an assessment of your carbon footprint in the design stage could reduce the emissions at the end of the project by up to 20%. It is an estimate because there's no data meaningfully in place at the moment on that. Now, what's been happening in recent years? Well, we've been aware for a number of years now of the need for action. And indeed, legislation tells us that the government is committed by way of a policy, and I say this is the UK government. It's different in Scotland, but in England 2050 is the target to achieve net zero. Scotland, it's 2045. So how are we doing? Well, it's estimated that from the UK Green Building Council analysis that UK construction industry in those 4 years has done very little to make a difference, to bite into that 40%. It's not happening very much at all. That's the challenge, ladies and gentlemen. If I move on, I don't know why my slide hasn't moved on. Let's have another go. No, it's completely frozen, Dawn. I'm afraid. There we are. I don't know. Did you do that?
No, I didn't do that.
Oh, right, okay.
Sometimes if you've been on a slide, it might go, oh, I'm going to stay here without moving. So just bear with it.
Yeah, and ladies and gentlemen, please bear with me when I try and master this transition from slide to slide. I've mentioned the UK government's net zero target, the global challenge. There's a need to reduce our carbon footprint. We addressed it at RICS with a whole life carbon first edition in 2017 and updated in 2023. Let's unpack some of the coverage of that assessment. We believe it's the first standard in the world that covers both embodied carbon and operational carbon. Well, what's embodied? Everything that goes into the choice of materials or components that go into a project, a building, a road. Whatever you're building and developing, you're making choices about what materials to choose. And in many facets of cost estimating and advising and option appraisal to our clients, in many cases, we might use the example of, let's just pick a frame of a building. That option appraisal may well say, well, should we go for steel or shall we go for concrete as the primary factor, the primary choice? And that has issues, and historically, surveyors and cost engineers have been able to advise their clients on the relative cost to build it and its potential for retaining its structural integrity over the life of the asset. Now there's an opportunity to say, as well as all that, these two different materials, steel or concrete, have a different carbon footprint, and that could be factored into the decision making, as well as the way in which the building or the asset, the infrastructure piece is put together. So it's all about the building, its construction, the embodied carbon that's used during its life, and what happens at the end of life. And we will get into discussion potentially about the circular economy and designing buildings now for their end of life and what we do with them and the potential for reuse. The operational side of carbon is, of course, the energy use that's used over the life of the asset. And that directly ties back to choices that are made and options given to clients about, let's pick the boiler for the heating of the building. Well, you can have a cheaper boiler now, Mr. Client, but it'll cost more to maintain and it will be less efficient in terms of its fuel usage over the life of the asset, or you can choose a more expensive boiler now, and the other side of the coin applies. It should be cheaper to maintain and its energy efficiency is much better. Now, I need to point out that at this point, as all good adverts do, that there are other methods of calculating carbon footprint and assessing what's involved are available. We're not the only show in town. We believe, though, we're the first one to cover both embodied and operational carbon in a single standard. Why? Well, simply because it will be better placing us as practitioners to advise our clients on the options available to them. Capital cost, yes, tick. Cost in use, yes, tick. And my carbon footprint, and potentially being able to advise clients as to the trade-offs between those three aspects. Now, this is a very busy slide, and I'm not going to talk through all of it. And indeed, just to be reassured, I don't know if I said at the top of the presentation, but these slides will be made available to you. What this maps out is the various stages that are involved in a project. We call it cradle to grave. There's many other titles that could be used, but it takes product selection, the actual construction process itself, the use of the building and its end of life, and acknowledges on the right-hand side of the slide that there are things which are outside the boundary, which are dealt with by others and are outside the terms of this particular standard and analyzing it. But you can see the aspects, the various elements, and those references. The line that says module, those references come from the relevant international standard. And unfortunately, I'm not able, sitting here, to quote the number, but if you looked at embodied carbon, you'd find that those modules are a standardized reference point when considering embodied carbon. Notice at the bottom of the slide the line of percentages, and therefore how important it is for the most appropriate product selections to be made because of the amount that it contributes overall to the total carbon footprint. And here's the process, again, in a slide, simply taking us through the life cycle of a typical project, and it takes data at the asset level initially and the data that's needed, and walks through at the various levels, including the data that's coming from estimates and from the as-builts, and walks through. Let me focus in on stage 3, the procurement stage. And this is where, in terms of cost engineering advice to our client, we're providing an estimate, and part of that advice will be an estimate of the carbon footprint. Well, how do you work that out? You clearly have got to come up with, as we do, a whole series of quantities. I need X cubic meters of concrete in this building, and therefore I've got a quantity. And now I can go to the EPD, Environmental Product Declaration, and there we are. The example on the slide is ready mixed concrete. So how much, and ladies and gentlemen, you will have noticed and will continue to notice that I am trying to speak in non-techie language. That's because it's easier for me, and it's more of a kind of a layman's approach to this. But obviously, you can see some very clever formulas there: kilograms per CO2 e, per SF. I'm not going to delve into that level of detail. Suffice to say that what does concrete contribute in the overall footprint of the building? Well, you can go to a ready mix concrete supplier and say, what's your EPD, please? And they will tell you. And when you're doing your estimate and providing the initial estimate for your client to the carbon footprint, how much of a problem is this design for you as a client when you look at your carbon footprint? How much of a problem is it? Well, I've worked it out line by line based on what's being proposed in terms of size of the building, what's being proposed in terms of its design, and the solutions that have been made in terms of materials, the concrete versus steel that I mentioned before. I've added in all the EPDs because I know what that is, but I also need to anticipate how the building is going to be built. And this standard, in terms of costing data, then takes things up a level or down a level, however you want to view it. So as well as saying, well, the 500 cubic meters of concrete equals X as a carbon footprint. Ah, yes, but where is it? Where is the concrete actually going to be put up? And then you say, well, where's it coming from? And then you start to debate, well, are we ready mixing on site? Or is it coming from a batching, and so on and so on. And the same argument could be applied to any number, indeed all of the components or materials that go into a building. And that's where we get into this debate about, I really should use materials which I'm sourcing locally. We have exactly the same thing in terms of the food that we eat, and suppliers who are very hot on saying what we are delivering to you and what we're serving to you in a restaurant is locally sourced. Not because we think it's the best necessarily, but it's because it's good for the planet in terms of the carbon footprint. Same applies if I was going to Paris. Either for business or pleasure. If I was going there, do I fly or do I go on Eurostar? And that question is driven by what? Well, cost, yes, of course, but also what's the relative carbon footprint for each of those modes of travel? Same applies in the building. Where's the concrete coming from? How far away do we have to transport the steel, and so on? And then you say, what about the guys? What about the putters uppers and the nailers downers and the laying the concrete people, the operatives? Where are they coming from? Are they local? We need to factor in if they're traveling across the country to get to the project. So all of that is captured in the standard, and it is therefore giving a standardized method of costing carbon. That's the headline for this webinar, and the cost of it is a number which actually says we think your building is going to have a footprint of 800 kilograms per CO2 e per whatever. So I don't worry about the formulas. The fact is a number comes out the end, and so the client can go, well, what would a client say at estimate stage if you said it's a £10 million building, it'll cost you £1 million a year to run it, and it's got a carbon footprint of 800 blah, 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 blah. Client says, what's that mean? And the second question the client may ask their advisors is, and how does that compare with other buildings of a similar type? How am I doing? Is that good or bad? Let me draw your attention to the bottom left of the slide, where I've put up there the logo for BECD, Built Environment Carbon Database. So when you get your answer, in theory, you can turn to BECD and say, here's my data from my building in London, and it looks like this, it's this size, and so on. Here's a feed-in to the data. Now, that BECD database was launched and generated by BCIS. Sorry about all these letters. The Building Cost Information Service. And they provide a database on construction cost and lots more as well. And this is a new initiative to provide a database for carbon footprint measures. In time, you'll be able to go to that database and say, I've got 800. Let me tell my client that that's pretty good compared with what other projects have achieved in the past. You get the picture, and because of time, I won't expand on that any further. Suffice to say that that running of the estimate gets better as the life of the project runs through to stages 3, 4, and 5. You've got better information, just like the cost of the project to build improves in its quality, so does the carbon footprint calculation as more information becomes available. Look, I've stayed on that slide quite long enough. Let's move on. And it may well be that I may well have covered much of what I've got on this slide because it just captures the thought process that goes on having produced a carbon footprint calculation. The key one is the third bullet point down: option appraisal, capital cost number 1, life cycle cost number 2, carbon footprint number 3. Option appraisal means, can I do better, says Mr. Client. Can I do better? If I want a balanced scorecard, I need to improve my carbon. What does that mean? So the advisor will say, well, you actually need to spend more money to be able to achieve a better carbon footprint. Not an attractive thing to say to a client if they have limited and a fixed budget, but that's the reality of life and will enable us as cost engineers and cost advisors to give our clients the ability to make an informed decision. And of course, you can see my question there. That's a client saying, is it worth it? And of course, the wider question, of course, is, can we afford, we collectively, we as the built environment sector, can we afford not to do something? We'll come back to the legal requirements because at the moment there is no legal obligation to undertake a carbon assessment. It's a good thing to do, but there's no legal obligation to do so. And I will come back later on to the landscape and what it looks like in terms of the current plans. Let's move on. Again, what I suspect I've done on that slide where I spent quite a long time on, I have probably covered all of these aspects. But just to highlight the fact that the Built Environment Carbon Database actually has two aspects to it. I have jumped to the second of those two in my previous commentary, and I've jumped to the repository for output data. How did my building do? It's got an answer of X. How does it compare with all other projects who have got answers A, B, C, D? And so that database is a comparator to be able to provide you with better and more comprehensive data on your individual project. The other aspect of the BECD, you will be relieved to hear, if you are a practitioner who is going to embark upon undertaking carbon footprint assessments for your client. The other aspect is that it has gathered, I think when I last asked the question of my friends at BCIS, BECD, I think it's gathered about 6,000 product pieces of data. So the good news is you do not need to go to each concrete manufacturer, each steel factory. You do not need to go to the industry and ask them individually what their EPD is for their product. BCIS, Built Environment Carbon Database, has gathered that all into one place, and you can freely grab it and use it in your analysis and your assessment. And I think I've said that there. Now, the problem I've captured as a throwaway line in my last bullet point is, of course, because this is all new, and it's a standard that we published and said this will be good to use, wouldn't it, for projects? And it is being used. It is being used. We're early days yet. You have to think in terms of, well, if we're going to start work on a project now, today, and we're going to start on the journey of carbon assessment, costing carbon for the project, if we're going to do that, we're starting at design stage. That output data is going to take a long time to come to fruition in the context of the completed project. I mean, how did we do looking back post completion? How did we actually do? And of course, there's an interesting comparator there. How good was our estimate 2 years earlier? And that, therefore, as a database is quite thin at the moment in terms of material. That's because it's all brand new, but that will grow over time to enable you to have a rich resource of comparable data in exactly the same way that BCIS has been producing similar cost data for 50 plus years in terms of the capital cost of a project. Likewise with carbon accounting. Now, there are a number of other relevant matters which I do need to highlight and which I'm sure you will be aware of, and that is that in September last year there was the pilot standard published, which is called Net Zero Building Carbon Standard. And it is a standard that's been produced by a consortium of a number of organizations. There's quite a few. I haven't, I'm not clever enough to provide the link, the Google link or whatever to the actual standard. But if you were to Google that phrase, it would take you to the Net Zero Buildings Carbon Standard. This is all part of the initiative that the government has established in terms of arriving at a net zero position for the country by 2050. And this is a standard which is seeking to enable people to work towards that. It's a pilot scheme, and they are encouraging and inviting support from industry as they're about to publish an updated version. So do check that out. What I'm not going to do because of the time available is to delve into the detail of the content of that standard. But it is and remains aligned with the whole life carbon standard that we produced. Let me just mention in passing Part Z, because I earlier referenced none of this is obligatory. None of this is mandatory. You do not need to do this currently, but clever people have drafted an additional part of the building regs, and they've called it Part Z, and that deals with exactly this carbon assessment issue. And if implemented, if introduced into the building regs, in theory, therefore not in theory, in practice, becoming a statutory obligation laid upon developers and their advisors to provide a carbon assessment for your project. And again, I would invite you, if you're not aware of the contents of that particular document, just to Google Building Regs Part Z. It is draft. So what you'll see is a suggestion document that forms the framework within the context of the wider building regs. It provides a context to be able to have a statutory obligation to do carbon assessments on your project. Now, that of course, we believe will actually spin out into the seeking and obtaining of planning consent for any project that you're involved in. It will probably become a planning condition that the requirements of Part Z, the demonstration of compliance with Part Z becomes part of the application for approval, in the same way that compliance with the rest of the building regs. And of course, we need to be mindful of the fact that as well as all of these issues over carbon assessment, at the same time, we are seeing building regs revisions because of building safety, flowing directly from the Grenfell Tower disaster and the launching of the Building Safety Act in 2022, which again introduced a whole raft of measures which developers and others are required to comply with to ensure that the building is safe and that we never have another Grenfell fire again. Ladies and gentlemen, you may have read certainly in the UK press, very, very big concerns which currently exist over the current arrangement. I'm digressing slightly, apologies, but with the building safety regime and the delay caused to projects because of the need to get through what's called Gateway 2, which is I've got a building which I've designed and I'm ready to start building it. Can I have approval, please? And compliance with the relevant requirements, as well as, of course, the challenges of the resources of the building safety regulator. Now, if, of course, Part Z, I only say that as a preamble, ladies and gentlemen, because if Part Z is legislated for and brought in as a statutory requirement, that will only increase the challenge over the need to comply with the rules when seeking permission for the building to proceed. Now, where are we currently with the UK government? I've already articulated the 2050 target. We will also be aware from the press that the previous administration and the current one are both quite cautious about the measures that they wish to take. The Labour government, as you may recall, when it was still in opposition, and their manifesto commitment of 28 billion spend in this whole area, and I won't articulate what that actually meant, but that was the headline statement. For the march to net zero, we're going to commit 28 billion pounds, and the rowing back from that has taken place. Why? Well, because we can't afford it. So therein lies a challenge for us in the UK, but equally globally over can we afford it? I said the same thing, ladies and gentlemen, down at the project level, where the client says, well, can I afford to take these measures, these expensive measures that you think I need to take to reduce my carbon footprint? With the answer, morally, the imperative, can we afford not to? Now, the UK as a country contributes 1% of the global footprint currently. And therefore, you could argue, and some commentators have, doesn't matter what we do, it doesn't matter what measures we take, it doesn't matter how keen we are to take this matter seriously, it's not going to make very much difference on the global stage when we look at attitudes elsewhere, the USA and China both contribute about 30% each to that global footprint. So over half of the total global footprint, with two countries, certainly with the US and a new administration there, frankly quite skeptical about the green issues. So there's a concern and a worry there that actually it's important to do the right thing for the planet. And notwithstanding our relatively little impact on the world stage, we're still believing that it is the right thing to do. And it's not a technical issue here. It's more of a hearts and minds battle. It's more of a convincing people that it is the right thing to do. And it may well be, ladies and gentlemen, that nothing serious is going to happen. Remember my top of the presentation slide on 4% movement from the construction industry over 4 years, 2018 to 2022. Not much has happened. People haven't really been taking this issue seriously. Hearts and minds need to be won over, and it may well be that only when matters are legislated for will there be a material change in the environment. So I think this is my last slide. Yes, it is. I just wanted to click on there just to reassure myself that I've got one slide, and that's this one. So what next? What next? I have, of course, touched on a number of these as we've gone through the presentation, but obviously it would be good that if you believe you need to be aware of these issues, a knowledge of the standard, well, a knowledge of carbon assessment generally, and specifically within the built environment sector, how it works and how we actually calculate the carbon footprint for a project from day one and right through its life. That obviously is a knowledge thing, but it's also a use thing as well. Adoption across the industry and across national boundaries is key. I guess it's probably true to say that the change in the hearts and minds battle is probably going to be top-down government and major clients. Well, government is a major client, and other private sector clients adopting it top down. This is what we're going to do, rather than the likes of individual consultants, cost engineers, advisors to clients, bottom up, saying we think this is a good thing you should look at, because of course the hurdle will be, why should I bother? Government buy-in needs to be sought and obtained, which only will serve to enhance the solution and the outcome. Doing nothing, and you and I know as delegates on this call that if you've been advising clients in this space for a number of years and you've been producing cost estimates for your client, you will be well aware that one of those options that the client has is, of course, to do nothing. And the cheapest solution of all in terms of your carbon footprint is don't do anything. but actually not taking this matter seriously, and that if it's acknowledged that the development has to take place, it's important to build whatever it is we're building. Let's say a road. It's important to build that road. And therefore the do nothing about carbon assessment is not an option. And as I referenced at the end of that slide there, the bigger picture is aligning with the government's overall march towards net zero. Now, whilst I have articulated here the built environment world, the construction sector, the infrastructure space, things that get built and developed, clearly that bigger picture relates to other issues which are outside our direct control. Things like arriving at not net zero, arriving at neutral in terms of our energy generation. So you will be aware, ladies and gentlemen, that another huge area for the country will be how do we generate our electricity, and what do we use? Wind turbines, solar power, tidal power, all those other issues. We're huge on the world stage in these areas, particularly in wind turbines, which is making a very significant contribution towards the overall energy picture. I mention that only because you need to be aware that the built environment, remember that 40% statistic at the very beginning of this presentation, 40% of everything is built environment. It's not everything. So there's huge areas in terms of energy generation that is marching towards net zero and the government's target. I'm going to stop at that point because we've got 15 minutes left, and I wanted the opportunity for questions. Now there is a health warning here, and there is my email address on screen. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're happy to share these slides with you. I'm very conscious it is only an overview of the subject, and I haven't delved into the detailed calculations. There are products available, there's training courses available, and there's material on our website to look at. But notwithstanding all of that, I do warn you that I may not necessarily be able to answer questions, particularly if they're of a more technical nature, because I'm not a specialist in this field. Dawn, may I hand back to you to moderate any questions that may have appeared? Thank you.
Yeah, no, and thank you, Steve. That's was a really illuminating talk that you've just given us. The two references you put to the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard and Part Z, I have actually put those into the chat, the links. So I think I've got the right links. It certainly looks like it.
Right.
So hopefully
it should say September 2024.
Yes, it does.
As a launch document. And as I mentioned, for the benefit of delegates, that was the pilot launch.
Yes, that's what I've done. Yeah.
And I don't think you're seeing on their website yet the final version, which was promised. And I think very wisely what we said was spring 2025, which introduces an element of flexibility over the delivery
with all of these things. Yes. So
but we were very conscious that in September, the ability to launch the final version with the benefit of feedback from industry relied upon that feedback. And if that hasn't happened, obviously it will delay such a response. Thank you. Yeah. And the other one is freely available, even though it's not statute. The Part Z is freely available for you to look at and assess what it means in terms of the statutory obligations. Thank you. Sorry, I'm only repeating myself now.
That's okay. So yeah, just for everybody, they will be available in the chat function, and I'll send those around with the slides afterwards. Well, I've actually not had any Q&A. Now, whether that means the software hasn't worked or actually people have been enthralled by your presentation and don't have any questions, I don't know. I will give it a couple of moments if people want to put anything into the chat or to the Q&A function, but both should be operational for people to submit if they wish to. While I've got a captive audience, though, I would like to remind you all of our annual conference that is coming up 14th and 15th of May. We are still looking for speakers. We are getting we're getting interest in, but we can always have more interest. If anybody fancies standing up and giving a presentation on a specialist subject amongst our themes, please do let me know. Please come back to me. Tickets are now available for the conference. They're on Eventbrite, and we will share information continuously with regards to the agenda speakers, etc., as we go through the next 3 months. The one thing we are bringing back is our Connect Hub, which will run over the 2 days. So if anybody wishes to participate in that, do watch out for information on that. Paul has just asked a question saying, excellent talk. Is there an inclusion of uncertainty? I'll hand back, Steve.
I don't. Sorry.
So Paul has written. Is there?
There isn't enough information in the question. Paul, are you? I don't know whether there's access to coming on.
Paul should be able to speak actually because of the role that he had on the in the software.
Can you just explain what you mean?
Yeah, is there a factor for uncertainty and cost depending on conditions or industry scale or something like that? Are the drivers?
I see what you mean. Thank you. And I should have picked that reference up because it is called exactly that, the uncertainty factor. So within the remit of the standard, there is the opportunity to say there are things that I actually don't know at this stage. And here they are, and you report on them as to what I haven't done because I can't, not because I don't want to, but I haven't got sufficient information. So the uncertainty factors, they do cover a number of elements, and those same elements, Paul and others on the call, you'll be aware of this from cost estimating and cost reporting to your clients when you're looking at capital cost of a project. There's uncertainties there, and historically we've called them contingencies, and we've set aside things I don't know. We need to perhaps make prudent allowance for. So why don't we add a contingency of X? The same applies with carbon accounting. Thank you for highlighting that, Paul, which I didn't cover because I didn't dive into the detail. But there is a way of calculating and arriving methodically and logically at a factor which you then add to the answer. So in the absence of information, you could come up with 750 as the answer, 750 kilograms per CO2 per, the measure, the formula I mentioned. But actually, the more accurate answer would be 800 because you've got 50 there, which is uncertainty. So you've got a means, and as long as when you report to your client, you make it very clear the uncertainty factor contributes X of the total. The client can take a view and be advised on that aspect of it. Now, whether there's an understanding there, I forgot to mention we also publish a client guide to the standard. So whilst if on the call you've looked at the standard while we've been talking and Googled it on the RICS website, you'll find it's 220 pages long. So it's not an easy read in terms of quantity of material. There is a 10-page client guide that we've written which says this is what it all means and this is why it's so important to you. Thanks, Paul. Yes, uncertainty is uncertain, but it's calculated into the figures. Thank you.
Lovely. So I've got another question relating to certainly the talk we've had, and then someone else has asked me about an authority question. So the technical question, well, it's not a technical question, but the question is, have you any suggestions, recommendations for systems which do a good job of integrating carbon estimating alongside cost?
Yeah, that's a good example of a question I'm afraid I can't answer.
Okay.
But in very general terms, I am aware of discussions with software houses. So I think that's the direction of travel
it is. So maybe
for the question.
Maybe what I actually could do is open that up to the floor and for them to use the chat to put in some systems that others people on the call have potentially used, and again that will then be visible. So I'm very conscious that we've got just under 4 minutes left. I don't know if there's any more questions regarding the webinar, which has been very interesting and illuminating. As I said, I've got a question over the authority and what we're up to, and along the lines of this has been a great virtual event. The question I've been asked is, what else are we doing? Are we as an authority doing face-to-face events, or what are we doing? And the simple answer is yes, we will be doing face-to-face events. We will be doing webinars. All of our regional communities and our technical communities of practice are busy putting their 2025 programme and schedule together, of which we will share. But there is one event coming up which will be face-to-face in London on the 4th of April. Don't quote, on the 4th of April, and I'm just waiting for the final sort of marketing material on that. And that will be discussing Section 29 of NEC4 contracts. But again, further information will be shared. So the short answer is yes, there will be face-to-face. Long answer is wait for that information to come out as we get more topics and more of our regions and communities of practice come back to head office and tell us what they want to do. Now, I did see something else just pop up. I don't know where that's gone. Maybe not. Okay.
Nope.
So,
okay.
So if there is, just a second, I thought there was another question. That's why I don't know quite why it didn't come up where I was expecting it to come up. So if the client wants to capture carbon costs, does this requirement need to be written into contract for supply chain for them to do it, or can they be asked as an extra, or is it unreasonable to ask?
No, of course it's not unreasonable to ask. What's going to happen in time is, of course, that the construction contracts and the ancillary tendering material that is used to procure the works will be capturing the obligation to produce a carbon assessment, as will the relevant consultants' appointment documents. We anticipate them all anticipating the need to produce a carbon assessment. It's certainly not the question quite rightly said, is it unreasonable? Well, if the client says this is how we're going to play the game, that's how it's going to be. Now, of course, the relevant consultant and the contractor can say no, thank you, and with the implications on whether the client and their team decide to pick that contractor or that consultant as appropriate. So that's what's that we anticipate that's what's going to happen, and obviously the relevant individuals or firms respond accordingly, subject of course to their ability to comply with the wishes of the client. Let me just unpack, Dawn, I'm very conscious of time. Let me just unpack that in further detail.
Yep.
Certainly from my experience and talking to, this is RICS members, in terms of taking on this standard and making use of it for their clients, will fall into two categories. There will be firms or individual surveyors who feel competent to undertake a whole life carbon assessment themselves as part of their work for their client. There's the other category who say we're not qualified, so Mr. Client, you need to appoint a separate specialist whole life carbon assessor whose job on the project is just to do the carbon assessment. There isn't one size fits all. It all depends on the relative knowledge experience of consultants, and then of course contractors. It's in the tender documents. When you produce your tender, we want a carbon assessment, please. What says the tendering contractor? And there's a whole debate around what that looks like in terms of the future direction of travel for the industry. But those are very relevant and practical spin-off issues that I haven't even begun to explore, because I was trying to capture the process rather than what does this actually mean for the industry in terms of getting to grips with doing assessments and reporting them to their client. But I could go on, but clearly time is not with us, Dawn.
No, time is definitely not. And I think we've brilliantly got to the hour or to the 2 o'clock. So I thank everyone for their time. This has been recorded. It will be available. The slides will be available, and I'll share those links. So thank you, everybody. And thank you particularly, obviously, Stephen. And I wish you all a good afternoon. Take care.
Thank you very much indeed. All the best. Bye.
Bye-bye.